Communist Party has not, uh, been shy about using force when it has to. And we don't know if it's reached that point yet. I don't think we're quite at that point, but I think if these protests were to continue, if they were to grow, I don't think anyone here would rule that out.
That's the sound of a protest in the financial district of Shanghai over the country's strict COVID rules. Demonstrations have now spread to several major cities in China. Police have been filmed beating some protesters and taking them away in police vans. Well, the protests have been described as the most significant public display of defiance since the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989. Jonathan Cheng is the Wall Street Journal's China bureau chief. He joins me now. Jonathan, welcome to the programme. Thank you very much for coming on. What's the latest? Have the protests calmed down or are they still ongoing and indeed increasing?
Well, they are still going, and I think part of what's happening here is that you're seeing people inspired by others coming forward and doing this. Certainly, you see it internationalizing. You see people in Hong Kong and in Canada and in the UK and all sorts of other places doing this. Of course, it's much easier to do that in a place that isn't China, because China is famously a place where they don't really welcome demonstrations. That's putting it mildly. And so it has been remarkable to see these protests in Beijing and Shanghai and Guangzhou and Zhengzhou and Wuhan and all these different cities across China, more or less simultaneously.
I must say I've been pretty struck by the accounts of how the sort of COVID lockdowns are still ongoing in China. I'm sure I heard someone earlier on our breakfast show talking about children in Beijing still being homeschooled after, 3 years? Is that a sort of an indication of the extent to which this has been, and has it been used as a method of control? Is that the sense that we're now getting?
Well, I think a lot of people are certainly thinking that it's being used that way. I think obviously public health is the official reason, and it does wax and wane with the case count. When infections are high, then we get lockdowns. I've been living in Beijing since the beginning of the pandemic, and we see the waves come and go. You right now, not a single restaurant or cafe or bar is open in Beijing right now, but a month ago, everything was open, and now schools are back online again, and many of us are in lockdown. I'm in lockdown right now, in fact, and so many of us are used to this, and that's both expats as well as Chinese nationals alike. It's been a part of life, and I think what we're starting to see is that as we enter a fourth year of COVID here, I can't believe it's 4 years of COVID. I think a lot of people are really at their breaking point, and I think that's really what you're seeing across the country.
How much time have you spent in lockdown then over the past 4 years?
Well, lockdown, I would say, obviously, when Wuhan, at the very beginning of the pandemic, we didn't know exactly what this virus was. I wouldn't say I was locked down, but there was nowhere to go. Nothing was open, and at that time, face masks were scarce, and everyone was just. It was better to stay inside. Over the past 2 months alone, I've had 10 days of quarantine, and I've had, I think, about 10 days of lockdown. So, and that's not unusual at all. I mean, you talk to almost anyone, and everyone's been through this cycle before. Many have had lockdowns far longer than mine. And again, if you're a parent and you have a kid who needs to take his classes or her classes online, it's not pleasant. And if you can't get food delivered, then it's existential.
So is it the case as well that children across China, but I mean, for example, I brought up Beijing earlier, are still being homeschooled? I mean, that's got to be incredibly bad for the mental health of the nation.
Yes, and I think that's part of what you're seeing. I mean, anyone who's a parent is really, really frustrated about all of this. It's not so much that it's been consistent. As I've mentioned, there have been long stretches where kids are going back to school. I think most of the latter half of 2020, most of 2021 was in-person schooling. But I think it's the unpredictability of it. The fact that if you have one case in your residential compound, then your whole compound may get shut down without any notice for 3 days, 4 days, 5 days. Could be a week, it could be 10 days, could be longer. And there's not a whole lot of transparency about this, and there's nothing you can do. There's no appeal that you can make, and that's just it. And I think it's the lack of control, and it's the lack of transparency, and it's the lack of any sort of a process that makes sense to people at this point, especially when people watching the World Cup here and anyone who has contact with the outside world knows that the rest of the world has basically moved past COVID, but not China. In China, we're still very much in it.
And how much do you think the Chinese government and Xi Jinping are in listening mode and will actually be troubled by what we're seeing, these sporadic protests across the country?
Well, I think there's reason to think both. I know that's a very wishy-washy thing to say, but the fact of the matter is, this is not a transparent government. They don't debate these things in front of us and in front of the world. So frankly, we don't know. But you saw signs of them being willing to do some compromise, because about 10 days ago they released these 20 measures that reduce the quarantine time and tweak things here and there to make things more palatable. But at the end of the day, I think what we're seeing with these protests is that it raised a false sense of hope that didn't quite follow through, and I think that's why people are particularly upset. But I think the other more sinister fear I think that a lot of people have is that you look at the history of China and you look at the history of demonstrations here, and the Communist Party has not uh, been shy about using force when it has to. And we don't know if it's reached that point yet. I don't think we're quite at that point, but I think if these protests were to continue, if they were to grow, I don't think anyone here would rule that out.
Just finally and briefly, do you think that the brutality with which the protests are currently being put down, which still, to our eyes seems pretty bad, do you think that that will act as a deterrent for protesters, or might it possibly just fan the flames?
Yeah, well, I think it has that possibility. And yesterday, as I said, I'm in lockdown, but my colleague was out there yesterday and was basically saying, look, the police are, if anything, looking to de-escalate in general. You're right that there are cases, I think, in Shanghai and in some other cities where people are being arrested, but I think in Beijing, perhaps because it's the capital and perhaps because the elites are here and it's so close to the center of power, I think there's a little bit of a reluctance to do anything that might make things even worse. But I think if they can sort of pick off the real troublemakers, the ones who are really in their face, maybe they feel like they can neutralize this and hope that it'll go away after a few days. But of course, that remains to be seen.
Well, Jonathan, I hope you're liberated from lockdown soon. Thank you very, very much for joining me. That was Jonathan Cheng, Wall Street Journal's China bureau chief, currently in lockdown in Beijing.